Women are always the victims of domestic abuse. Fact. Men are usually the aggressors in a domestic abuse situation. Fact. Men are inherently more violent, which is why that's the kind of domestic abuse that they inflict on women who are the victims. Absolute fact. Now, if you were to say to me, Atif, you don't know what you're talking about, you'd actually be right. Let me deal with men and women as far as domestic abuse is concerned, and we treat them both absolutely equally. No discrimination here whatsoever. But we understand that the system is such where men are being seen as the aggressors and women are always being seen as the victim, even when it comes to the police. We dealt with a particular case where this guy doesn't have a single combative bone in his body, yet the police accused him of being the aggressor. Let me tell you about his story. So he came from India. He's in his mid-30s. He married a woman who was a British national who was in her late 40s to early 50s. Now, her being that age was psychologically prone to being insecure. At least that's what the circumstances showed us. So she would prevent him from cutting his hair because he would look more appealing to women. She would prevent him from wearing good clothes because she would think that he would be more appealing to women and women would approach him. She would prevent him from going to the gym because she'd think there are other women there and women would find him attractive and women will then approach him. She therefore controlled how his appearance was, and by virtue of that fact controlled his ability to be confident. She also monitored his phone to make sure he was going where he said he was going and that he was coming back when he said he was coming back. She also looked through his phone to make sure that there were no communications happening with anyone else, and she thought that she had control of all his paperwork. Now, this is probably because of her age, because she was a lot older. She probably thought, I can control these things. So she thought his property was her property. Let me tell you what happened on one occasion. She started ripping his paperwork. That's right, ripping his birth certificate, ripping his passport, ripping his documents that he would use for a leave to remain application, because she said the relationship is over. Now, if the relationship is over, why is she ripping his documents? He recorded it, but the recording wasn't facing her, it was facing down. We could just hear her. He was simply saying, why are you tearing my documents? And she was cackling and laughing, saying, because I can. This is why I'm doing it. What are you going to do about it? In that particular situation, police were called. The police came and they immediately saw him as the aggressor and her as the victim, probably because of her age. Now, because we were dealing with this case, we wanted to get hold of all the information that we could in order to determine where we stand from an evidential standpoint. So we got hold of information associated with when the police attended. There was a voice note. In that voice note, he says, she's ripping my papers, she's ripping my passport, she's ripping my birth certificate, and she's trying to burn it. The police turned around and said, what did you do to make her do that? How ridiculous is that question? Somebody's property is being destroyed and the police turn around and say to him, what did you do that caused her to do that? You must have done something. Eventually they kicked him out, and that's when he got in contact with us. Now, when we were going through his evidence, we noticed that there is a deficiency in evidence because he had never collected any evidence before. He had never collected evidence in relation to the controlling behavior, absolutely nothing. All we had was a recording where it wasn't showing her face, it was facing downwards, and he was saying, why are you tearing my documents? She was laughing and cackling and saying, because I can. So we got that transcribed and sent it to the Home Office. The Home Office refused the application because they said there's a lack of evidence. When the refusal came through, I said to him, has anything happened between us submitting the application and the refusal? And he said, yes, she's got rid of my car. She's either sold it or scrapped it. And I said to him, did you tell anyone? He said, Bhai, main kisko bataun? What that translates to is, brother, who do I tell? The vulnerability in his voice at that point made me realize what kind of character this person is. This is not a combative character at all. This is somebody who's leaving everything to God effectively, and he's saying, well, what can I do? Who do I tell? This is somebody who was failed by the system, by the enforcement system, the police who came to him and accused him where his documents were being destroyed, so he didn't have the confidence to tell the police. He didn't even tell me, so I told him, go to the police, let's find out what's happening. Nothing happened about it. They inquired a little bit about the car, but that was it. Nothing happened. But now we had a crime reference number, and we also have a pattern of behavior. So previously she thought that his documents were her property, so she did with it what she pleased. Now she thought his car was her property and she did with it what she pleased, whether it was to sell it or scrap it. So we had a pattern of behavior and we had previously corroborative evidence to show it, meaning his previous word in relation to how she behaves. So we made arguments in relation to that. We used the crime reference number. He was still receiving therapy because of what he went through, because nobody deserves to go through that. So he was still receiving therapy, and we made a second application. In that application, we put all of this together and we made legal and factual arguments to show this pattern and to effectively spoon feed to the Home Office that this is the guy that you're expecting evidence from. This is the guy who's basically saying, what do I do about it if she sold my car? Who do I tell? This is the guy you're expecting evidence from. So we made arguments in relation to the pattern that we saw in relation to her treating him and his property, if as it were her own. And then we showed the pattern in relation to what kind of character he is and the expectation that they have on this particular character to provide evidence in those circumstances, which effectively means the evidence that we're providing is the best type of evidence we can provide in this particular situation, and he should not be prejudiced because of the way he is in terms of his ability to be able to think far enough to be able to get evidence. That application was thankfully successful, and if it wasn't, you could bet your pretty penny that we would have gone all the way with it, because this is somebody who was failed by the system. This is somebody who suffered domestic abuse, and this is somebody who doesn't deserve to be treated that way. So this is a situation in relation to how a male can be treated in a domestic abuse circumstance and how docile sometimes they are, because they just don't know what to do, especially when they are vulnerable and they come into the country not knowing how the rules work, knowing also the systematic rhetoric out there in relation to how vulnerable women are. We've had another situation like this where the person who was in the UK had a speech impediment, and it was very difficult for him to be able to speak, for which he was bullied and also for which he was treated lesser than, to the extent that there was a child that he was taking care of, which in an argument turns out that wasn't his child, but the partner refused to do a DNA test and enforced him to continue to pay maintenance for, and it turned out it wasn't his child. Men go through a lot as well. Let's not forget that. Now, in relation to that particular case, I'll be doing a video about that. He's been kind enough to make a video for me that I'll be posting here, and I'll be giving you the background in relation to that and what we argued in relation to that. And I'm going to tell you from my perspective that I have to work a lot harder on male cases than I do on female cases, just because of the understanding that females are more vulnerable than males, and that should not be the case, because men suffer domestic abuse and women suffer domestic abuse, and because of the way they are psychologically, men inflict domestic abuse differently and women inflict domestic abuse differently on their respective others. So to identify the victims, we need to be able to understand what kind of domestic abuse has been inflicted, and sometimes the kind of domestic abuse inflicted on men isn't considered domestic abuse, even though it is. And sometimes even by men it's not considered domestic abuse, but it is. If you've been a victim of domestic abuse, whether you're a male or a female, feel free to get in contact with me and we'll be more than happy to consider your case.